our last presentation, which will happen now by Kadambari Baxi. I'm very happy that she agreed to take part in our symposium because among many other things, Kadambari has also is actually still part of a very important collective who builds your architecture. Actually, it's a collective that has very much shifted the conversation about labor and architecture on the building site, actually by reminding us as architects exactly the question, who builds our architecture? And I think this is really the best way actually to conclude our symposium, because the issue of activism and advocacy, of course, is a very important way in which to make more evident the labor of construction, the politics of construction, which today are among the most also oppressive. They really offer the most oppressive conditions for labor in general, and it's something that is rarely discussed, if not in a kind of dismissive way, as it was mentioned before. Kadambari is an architect and educator based in New York, and her current work focuses on climate activism and novel forms of architectural agency. And she has participated to many exhibitions, like the Oslo Triennale and others. And then she also teaches at the she teaches actually at Barnard College of Columbia University. So she also teach actually these things in academia. But I think for me it was very important to have her actually also as a representative of this collective who builds your architecture, because in the context of today really project us to the contemporary, let's say, problems and issues related to building and constructions. So Kadambari, thanks a lot for being with us. And I'm very much looking forward to your presentation. Yeah, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pierre, and definitely for the invitation as well. And as you mentioned, that as a non-historian in this panel, I think perhaps this discussion around activism and agency is something that I'm really looking forward to as well. So thank you. Should I share my screen?
Yes. Yeah, you can.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Okay. Can everyone see my screen, and can everyone hear me properly?
Absolutely.
Yes. Okay. Great. So thank you again for this invitation. And as you just mentioned, Who Builds Your Architecture is an advocacy group that asks, how can architects better understand how the production of buildings connects their design and consulting practices to the workers who ultimately build them? And I should say, as Pierre just mentioned today, how they build them today. The core members of the groups are listed here. Our collective has also benefited from contributions from many others, including colleagues, students, and collaborators in architecture, academia, construction, and human rights. And I see that in the participants, we also have some of our key collaborators, Peggy Deemer, Paolo Trombesi, so hello. And I also see alums in the audience, one alum, so I want to just say hello as well. And thank you for being here. So as Pierre requested, I'm here to share brief excerpts for WBYA's work, but also to share our working methodologies. I hope, as I said earlier, this can lead to a general discussion around activism and agency in our field at large, and particularly at this moment. To that end, I'll note certain tactical approaches in the group's work. The first is simply to insert this question, who builds your architecture, again and again, as we've seen throughout, I think, today and in the various presentations. So it has been really, really thrilling to be here and to see this question being repeated in this context. We wanted to frame this question in a way that supposes a distinction that can be rendered visible. That architecture is essentially a collaborative process, cannot be an afterthought, just as Christine mentioned just a few minutes before. Not only can this question be taken for granted, but what if this question does not appear towards the end, but is at the beginning of any process of building, and in their histories as well as their futures? With this in mind, our group chose to name itself in the form of a question. For us, this one question sparks inquiries into many aspects of the discipline, from ethics to practice to education to technology. This is a recent exhibition at the Boston College at the Boston Architecture College last year, where we used large vinyl drawings on the storefront to bring this aspect of the exhibition to the street. Magnified fragments from drawings, the full drawings are displayed inside the space, and we extracted elements to display on the street. A close-up photo. The red walls and tables inside contain more detailed information about the workers and posters on how to promote fair labor practices in architecture. One thing to mention here that we represented workers elsewhere, and we talked also about workers who produced the exhibition and including these vinyl drawings inside the exhibition. A view at night, the worker drawings loom large both inside and outside the gallery. For another exhibition at the Art Institute of Chicago, the wraparound display links design construction networks and case studies in 4 cities. The case studies include diagrams from an interactive database where we tracked a single building element, a facade, a building facade, in selected projects in 4 cities, and all actors involved in the process: architects, contractors, construction workers, etc. The red titles and symbols mark that where that information was available and where it wasn't available. In other words, what we could and what we could not find, as marked by the question mark. And you can see in the red text in one of the projects, one trade center, we could go as far as to list the unions of which the workers, some of the workers were part of, but again, that it ends there. I'll come back to this database later, but this database it uses Graph Commons, a data visualization platform developed by an artist technologist based in Istanbul and New York, Burak Arikan. Another key document for WBYA, and perhaps this speaks most directly to this symposium in certain ways. Here, the approach was to produce drawings that connect architects and workers in a direct line. They link territories of a design construction network of a transnational project. A hypothetical stadium construction site is in the middle, and architects and migrant workers are placed at 2 extremes. In between are dispersed sites across vast distances. The left side begins with architects based in New York. The middle, there's a construction site of a stadium, hypothetically somewhere in the Middle East. And on the right are migrant workers that from places like Nepal that move and go towards the construction site in the middle. Overlapped are more detailed views of spaces and sites through which move documents, materials, and workers. This drawing imposes a forced symmetry on processes and conditions that are often highly unequal, but remain linked, if not interdependent. So this slide shows the detail of a steel truss as it moves from an architect's office to an engineer's office, to its fabrication and shipping, to its ultimate arrival on a building site. And of course, these are all dispersed sites across the globe. The other side charts the path of a migrant construction worker as they travel from villages to urban training centers, to airports, to labor camps, to the same building sites. From both sides, architects, steel trusses, and migrant workers arrive at a common site. Overlapping aerial site maps, views move from axos to perspectives to reveal details of spaces of production, migration, and some of the actors involved. And this is probably not a surprise to anyone in this symposium, but the left side of the network today, with its highly developed management systems and software, tends to run fairly efficiently most of the time. Minute changes and coordination across this vast network across the globe is easy. For example, a change in the location of a bolt in the truss can be made fairly easily across the system from design to implementation. However, on the right side, difficulties faced by migrant workers at various points remain highly localized. To some participants in the same network, they also remain largely invisible, or as was just pointed out in the previous question, it's considered not related to their professional work. These drawings source information from reports by human rights organizations. They report extensively on the exploitative labor conditions, especially in the Middle East. Some have called these conditions modern-day slaveries. Others have used the definition of forced labor or unfree labor. And I think this is a discussion. How is labor, this type of labor, defined? And United Nations takes certain positions with it. But I think as architects, we also need to think about the different definitions of labor or workers that we use or talk about. From poor housing as labor camps to substandard wages, to unfair recruiting conditions, to guest workers with no access to citizens' rights, they document the dark side of architectural sites. For a quick summary, I'm going to play this video by Bill Van Aswald from Human Rights Watch. And this was really our first panel going back to 2012. But I think that it was really critical to revisit this today, because this describes condition, perhaps you might say at the height of neoliberal economy and kind of a hyper-globalization of architectural sites. I think post-pandemic, we have enormous challenges to face in this context. So I thought it was important to just see what the conditions were then and what might be expected as we move forward.
I mean, the United Arab Emirates, 90% of the population is foreign and will never be able to get citizenship, and many of them are construction workers who will, you know, they have very little ability to advocate for their rights. Really, an awareness of the entire context of who's involved in this activity that you as an architect are helping to get off the ground. And so I think it would be useful just to bring this down to a very human level. Who builds your architecture? To just imagine yourself as you're from a Southeast Asian country. Maybe the majority are now coming from Bangladesh. These are people who may never have left their village. They tend to speak an incredible number of languages, but Arabic and English are not among them. You have very little chance of ever pulling yourself out of poverty if you stay where you are. So you've heard about an opportunity to go to the rich Gulf and work for a few years and then come back home, and you could buy property, you could invest, you don't have to go to the Grameen Bank. You've got your own money. So you would, and the way you've heard to get there is to go to a city, and you go to a labor supply agency who says, well, we'll get you there, but you're going to have to pay us, say, $3,000, $2,500, $3,000. That's more money than you've ever seen in your life, and you don't have it. So you sell your wife's gold jewelry, you mortgage your small house, and you collect all the money you can from your relatives. Maybe you get $1,000. You need to go to a money lender. The money lender, because you have no real collateral, you can't go to a bank, even the Grameen Bank. And so you take out a loan from a moneylender at 10% per month interest. You don't sign a contract, or maybe you sign a contract, or maybe you just sign your name on a blank piece of paper in your home country. Then you wind up in Abu Dhabi or the Dubai airport, and you get sent to Abu Dhabi. There you sign a different contract, written in Arabic and English, which you don't understand, which may be completely different from what you thought you were doing. It may not only be a different job. I met people who thought they were going to be working, cooking food for people in a hotel, because the name of the construction site was the name of a hotel, but they wound up building the hotel for about a third of the money that they were promised. The average was often 50% less than you were promised by this labor sending agency in your home country, was what you actually wound up getting paid. So now you're on the work site. You may not be happy. You're there for about 3 years. Maybe you're being underpaid. Maybe you're being paid late. Maybe working conditions are poor. Maybe your housing conditions are poor. But you really have no recourse, because you owe money to the guy who lent it to you, and you are going to have to work for whatever it is that you've been offered. You can't unionize to demand better treatment. You also can't switch employers, because your work visa is limited to that specific employer. So if you quit, you are illegally present in the country. And it would be difficult to quit anyway, because the employer has your passport. So if you quit, you'll be deported. If you try and get a new job, you'd be deported. Some people do quit and work for other employers, but only the most unscrupulous employers who'd be willing to take the risk to employ you, and in exchange for taking that risk, they're going to exploit you even worse and pay you even less. So that's the sort of broad sphere. I mean, that's the whole sort of human story that one needs to think of and that one needs to capture when one thinks about one's responsibility.
So it was this panel, going back again very to the first panel, that led to further discussions about what architects can do. And our tasks really has been to bring these kind of discussions, reports, etc., to the architectural discourse in schools, as well as through practices. And so very quickly, this kind of moving discussion led to this idea of perhaps drafting an architect's pledge for fair labor. And while we were convinced that we could get hundreds of architects to sign this petition, we were doubtful of its impact. What happens after someone signs a petition? What will it really change? Instead, we began a series of workshops to really try to understand these issues, but also to kind of understand the territories of the practice in general. How is architecture practiced? How is the architecture practice governed or not governed in some cases? And really to keep this sort of diagram between architect and migrant workers and the various other actors involved in the entire process. What sparked our initial effort was a petition that we received from the Gulf Labor Artists Coalition. Its signatures refused to work with the Guggenheim Museum and its proposed expansion at the Saadiyat Island in Abu Dhabi, designed by Frank Gehry. Our first reaction was to look at towards the internal architects' codes of ethic. And this is an image where we use the AIA, at this point, fairly old code of ethics, although there haven't been that many revisions to it, although I hear they're working on it. in any case, we found that you can already see here that there are 3 clauses for the environment, and there is one very generic clause for human rights. Another thing I'd like to note that often these kind of documents are really, the actors are most of the time kind of a sustainable practice kind of discourse, which is very, very general. And the actors usually are mentioned are architects, clients, and members of the organization. And that's where these kind of documents frame this kind of discourse on code of ethics. Some of these documents I'm sharing are documented in a critical field guide that we produced, Who Builds Your Architecture, that's available to download from our website, whobuilds.org. And we started looking at networks of these transnational building projects. For example, here, the Hamad International Airport in Doha, where you can see in gray the architects in the US, engineers in Europe, Buro Happold, contractors in Japan and the Middle East. And in red are all the countries that are sending migrant construction workers to this construction site. We also started looking at the kind of reliance of to US and Europe-based firms on these transnational projects. So here you start seeing architects, some of the 20 architects in white, the construction companies in gray, and construction sites in the Middle East in the red, and then just figures around the gross billing at that time from these big architecture firms that are reliant on the works around the world, and then the informal construction worker worldwide economy. So these are the type of documents that became part of our workshops that we tried to study, including the human rights reports. And from there, we asked participants to start creating diagrams, trying to understand these kind of vast networks, but also how can architects intervene or even begin to just draw and make sense of these kind of really, really large networks. And then these kind of documents were then used to produce other kind of public exhibitions and forums. This is just going back to the interface that I shared earlier, where just with 2 projects in one city, in each city, in this case, we had chosen Doha, Chicago, New York, and Istanbul as 4 cities, and we looked at 2 projects from each city. And then we tried to look at whatever information was there in the public records, and you can see on the right, the union workers, the lawsuits that's reported, and we could find some information. It wasn't exactly not available, but I think in some ways, a lot of our work has flipped back and forth between assembling information that zooms into these very minute localized details, for example, monthly wages of workers, to producing these kind of large, or let's say to understanding the large multinational networks that are also linked to these very localized conditions. And in that respect, it would not surprise anyone here that even in that one detail or just one building element of a building facade or curtain walls, we found many of the same big construction companies that are also operating in all these cities like AECOM or Permasteel Group. So this interface is available online also, and you can play with it and look at different projects and what we've found. And so this information then, as I mentioned, becomes part of the public exhibition that one especially we created at the Art Institute of Chicago, where this information was really used for a general public and kind of a larger, let's say, audience that's beyond architecture and design, so that this larger network is understood through, and we created drawings to kind of fairly detailed drawings that would play out some of these scenarios, but also kind of start very quickly defining where architects could intervene. So for example, here, there's in the red dot you see at the bottom, deploy architecture documents as toolkits. And this is where the workers are getting trained before they even arrive at the construction site. So this was one idea that came out in some of our workshops and panels. And then just very quickly, I would go through some of the others that came. And so these little descriptions are written for a general audience that they can understand kind of this entire network. So ideas about how do you improve basic standards for workers' housing, etc. These are very quick ideas that in a way can be worked upon further, but in a way we felt that even just with our small workshops, we could come up with kind of ideas very quickly in terms of how these kind of issues can be addressed. Expand architecture code of ethics that I just talked about. And then this idea of whether consultants like human rights experts can become part of larger architectural teams as well, when architects work on transnational projects especially. Some of the more, here I just talked about the employ human rights experts on design teams, give credits to all workers in the entire process of design to building. And these are just some last few images. I wanted to end with kind of a quick image of a workshop that we did in Istanbul, as this was something that we found quite inspiring in our work. This was, as I mentioned, a workshop at Studio X Istanbul, GSAP Studio X. And the participants in the workshop included young architects, members of construction unions, lawyers working with them, and they were also narrating to us a pretty complex case of a fire on a job site and then the various actors involved. But what was really interesting here was also just looking at the different kind of definitions of workers, whether they're able to unionize or not, how much they are paid, etc., kind of emerging as a network that can be drawn, and certain critical information can be placed precisely to see where changes could be made, or more importantly, should be made or lobbied for, or in a way, what kind of agency would architects have in a way to start influencing some of this discussion. And another interesting aspect of this workshop was that many young architects in Istanbul end up working for big construction companies. There are many recent graduates, many different architecture schools. There are not enough architecture jobs, and therefore they end up working with construction companies. And one of the results of that has been that they have joined construction unions as architects, because there are no unions for architects. And it's through that they also then participate in many strikes, or at least are present. While we were there, we visited many sites, and this was one of the strike on one of the projects where the workers hadn't been paid for a month. And finally, they decided to just walk out and just kind of make their conditions visible, but also quite audible. And it's really interesting that the architects, these young architects, not only follow these sites and document them, but then really also join or are present at some of these strikes. And these are just the last two images I wanted to, this is back in New York. And I wanted to show this image. This is just outside my window on the street. What you see is the gate of Columbia University campus. And this is a protest by a union. And often these giant inflatable rats are used by some of the unions when they're protesting non-union jobs. And this was sort of interesting because I've always seen one or two rats, but I've never seen this kind of entire army of rats that has shown up at my own institution here outside my window. And to sort of say that this is actually a project that hasn't even started yet. There is no construction site yet, but it's being planned. But I wanted to end with this image to also say that this discussion that we've also heard in some of the presentations earlier today about unions and labor unions and their kind of impact is a really complex one. And I think that today it's also very complex because of the status of many different kind of workers who are either part or not part of the workers, and particularly the tensions between some of the immigrant groups and undocumented workers that are on the construction site. And so just to say that this is again a kind of a discussion, or I think these kind of issues, again, we've heard what was really impressive about today was kind of this discussion. I think at least in this panel almost came up at every other presentation in these projects that are historical projects. And I think that we really need to produce a discourse now that starts understanding some of these very complex issues, but also tries to make them visible in these different kind of forums and our different practices. And so finally, I wanted you to leave with this last image. This is very much our work in progress. And this is for upcoming workshops that we are planning around imagining a new code of ethics. And here I wanted to emphasize 3 points. First is that building typologies matter. So in this case, you can see that the first row here, which imagines, which poses these questions of thinking about buildings, the prison, the factory, the super tall. How does the prison proliferate inequality? And I think that for a prison and the factory and the super tall, it's probably not that difficult to imagine how this kind of an institution or a building would proliferate inequality. But then when we got down to the bottom row, how does a single family house, everyday single family house, or even a multi-family apartment building or a mixed use tower, how do they proliferate inequality? And I think this is where we need to start kind of drawing power relations among actors or economies of producing such buildings. And these, again, are not perhaps difficult things. These are difficult things to draw out or to even write about. And I think this is the kind of task that we all really need to take on. And the second is the material realities and building details. They link contexts near and far. And where do these material realities and building components and single building details, where do they fall in the spectrum of inequality? And finally, who are the actors that need to be at the table to theorize any types of new types of code of ethics? In what type of spaces might we imagine a conversation taking place between an architect, construction manager, construction worker, and historian? Where would that conversation take place? Would it take place in an office, a school, or an installation, or a construction site? And how might that collaboration produce visual documents that appear on an office, on your wall, on your smartphone, and on a construction site? And so I feel like I want to recruit everyone from this symposium to join our campaign. Thank you.
Thank you, Kadambari, for this fantastic presentation that I think very much put together many of the things we have discussed today from, of course, an historical perspective, but of course, also with awareness that the present is rooted also in the way in which our profession, our discipline, our knowledge has been produced. But I think your presentation very much bring this kind of approach to the present. There is something that I found for me very important to at least from my point of view as a teacher of architecture, something that I found very important, which is in a way how your advocacy, your activism, let's say, in the realm of construction and building, somehow use the traditional means of architectural discipline, which is drawing. Something that if there is maybe an expertise that as architects we can still claim and be acknowledged for is drawing. Perhaps it's not building anymore. Certainly is drawing. And of course, we know that the history of drawing is, of course, also very problematic because the identification of the architect with drawing is also the moment in which of course, the architect downgrade, in fact, manual labor. But I found interesting how those techniques like axonometry, perspective, infographics, diagrams, somehow are twisted to become tools to depict labor. And I think there is nothing more difficult than the depiction of labor. Because, of course, there is always a risk of giving very reductive images or very reductive. And I think, of course, architects often like to show a building site with the helmet, and that's usually how they represent their hands-off attitude vis-a-vis labor. But I think you need this kind of much wider perspective. Actually, some of these drawings remind me a lot of the artist Mark Lombardi, who actually used this technique of diagrams to map a very complex, let's say, social or political, geopolitical conditions. So I think this is for me very important that since actually within our PhD program, we have also a PhD by design, I think that your technique of representation or depiction of the complex reality of labor has been, in my opinion, extremely inspiring. And I really hope that we will, the students actually and the PhD candidates will learn from this approach and not actually only use the traditional manuscript, let's say, but also use something for which we, as architects, we have something to say. The other things that perhaps I want to remark is exactly what you said at the end. I mean, the kind of displacing of the locus in which to theorize architecture, and I think that this bridge between I think also Christine has remarked on that, the bridge between the historian on one hand, the architect, the union activist. For me, this is an incredible let's say, line that finally really address, the idea of architectural form in its true meaning, which is not just the shape of a building, but it's kind of vast network of histories, of realities, of building processes. So I found really this last presentation for us also a way to really summarize many of the things, and I really want to thank you. We have actually some question from the audience that is already on the chat.
There's one person actually with their hand raised also.
Yes, please come forward. You can make the question directly on the, let's say, to the speaker, without us having to read the question. Please come forward. I mean, WBYA is the most, as Alvin Boroyaski used to say, we are the most forgiving audience. So we have a question from Miruna Ciura. Sorry for my...
Hi. It was largely answered during the presentation, so I hurried a bit. It's okay.
Okay. So anyone wants to?
Can I say something?
Yes, please.
I thought that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. And I didn't know about your work, so I can't wait to find out more. But I'm very struck by the way it's depicted in drawings, a bit as Pier Vittorio was saying. And I was just trying to compare what you've been doing with what's been happening with the way architects are responding to the climate emergency, and how practices have taken on this responsibility to think about the implications of design decisions in terms of, carbon and carbon footprint and the whole equation to do with climate change. And I was just wondering, it's so, this hasn't happened with Labour. And in fact, you could do the same sort of thing at every stage of the design process, the manufacture of components right through, which is what I think you've been trying to do. You could get design practices to consider the implications of each decision. Is that what you're doing with practices?
I think that, again, to say that we're not the only ones, I think, working on this. There are other groups. There are some groups that I would say, are focused more on kind of material issues and fair labor practices to do with kind of different materials and where they come from. I think this, again, is a kind of a larger conversation in a way, because I think very quickly, which is what perhaps also happened with, I think, some of the environmental sustainability discourse, that it became this kind of leads, like, some of the professional organizations are doing it more in a way that it becomes this kind of a checklist, or often what's called a matrix that, kind of says what is fair labor. And I think we can also look at the kind of garment industry or electronic industry that has also tried to do that. But in some ways, we felt that that's a little bit of an easy answer, perhaps, because I think the situation on the ground is very complex. And I don't think we can just say that this material is fair labor, like the fair labor coffee that we can feel good about drinking because we think, oh, well, this is fair labor coffee, and therefore we can still spend $5, on a latte. But it really, to then trace, like, how much of that really makes it back to the workers is really where the problem lies. And I think that for that, some of the work that on the ground is very important. That's really done either by the human rights organizations or even local NGOs that are working in many of these different places. And I think what we've tried to do that is to bring that kind of discourse, but in a way for us, it's important. I think maybe that's what you're raising. For us, it's to connect that to our discipline, to architects who are kind of practicing, or to students. And therefore, some of the techniques of drawing, et cetera, that we were just discussing earlier, I think we really focused on that because we wanted to kind of do drawings that we do every day and we may use for our other kind of projects. And how do we reuse them in a way to kind of bring attention? As you're saying, some of these things are not really that easy to draw, as you're saying, even in the various steps in the process. But I do think that we do have this ability of sort of multimedia where we can use videos, and we can bring images and photographs, etc. So we've been trying to again think about that, like how do we don't have access to these kind of some by design, some of these places where things are being produced, but how can some of these new technologies, bring that? So again, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but to say this is what is a challenge for us also, and how do we work on that? Yeah.
Thank you.